Hi, everyone. I'm here with Kelly Ryerson, who is an activist against glyphosate, one of the MAHA moms, and a board member of Moms Across America. Is it called, Kelly?
That's right. Moms Across America.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
How did you become aware of glyphosate initially, and what is it?
So I became aware of glyphosate. I had no idea. First of all, just a little background. I had a diet that was pretty standard American, probably. I grew up actually with a mom that cooked wonderful meals. When I got off on my own, I no longer took care of myself and was eating all kinds of junk. Um, and it worked for a while until it didn't. And I started getting a lot of just symptoms around my body that seemed unrelated to one another. So I was having things that are really pretty common now, actually, like digestive issues. I was losing hair. I had like numbness in my hands. I had rashes. Um, Eyesight was kind of starting to go. And these things that seemed unrelated in my body were all malfunctioning really over the course of a few months. And so I ended up going from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor, and they all would do blood work and they're like, we don't see anything wrong with you. I'm like, but I know something's wrong. But of course, because this is medicine as we know it in the United States, they would say, well, maybe you're stressed or anxious, and that's causing your physical symptoms. And so they started layering antidepressants on me. And by the time I was done seeing all these doctors, I was on two antidepressants, a benzodiazepine, steroids, gabapentin, and I was a total wreck. I just, because all these things have side effects. And anyway, I never felt like that was the problem. And I continued getting worse. And then finally, someone said, one of the doctors, like, I really genuinely think you need to see a psychiatrist. This is really just in your head. I'm like, okay. I can barely walk at this point because I have no energy, but okay, maybe it's in my head. So I went to see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist had intake blood work that happened to have vitamins on it. It was the first time that any vitamins had been tested. And I came back severely malnourished. Like I had scurvy, which is no vitamin C. I had no thiamine. I had barely any B12. My D was literally a one. So my body was slowly dying. I went back to my doctor with these results. I'm like, I think this is it. I think I'm really malnourished. And she said, oh no, those vitamins, they don't really mean much. Don't read too much into that. I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure. So I went and found a new doctor. The new doctor said, I think you should try giving up gluten, because a lot of people I know, and particularly women, are having success giving up gluten and having a resolution of their symptoms. And so I did that. I started eating a little more cleanly. And lo and behold, all of these symptoms started to disappear. And I was eating good things. The minerals and vitamins were getting back in my body. And so I started thinking, what on earth is it about gluten that now we have this enormous epidemic of people that don't tolerate it and have non-celiac gluten sensitivity? So I went off to a conference at Columbia University where they're a preeminent celiac center, actually, and they were studying gluten sensitivity as well. And they wanted to know the same thing I did, what's causing this drive in incidence. And so someone said, I actually think it might not be the gluten. I think one of the researchers said, I think it might be something other than the gluten, maybe something else on the grain. And so I went to the microphone and I said, well, what do they spray on it, like on the farms? Do you think it could be we're reacting to a pesticide? And people turned and looked at me and they're like, no, I don't think that, that wouldn't cause that. I'm like, okay, well, so I sat down, and then a scientist from General Mills was there because he was there promoting the General Mills gluten-free Cheerios and talking about how hard it is to get gluten-free products to market. And he found me and he said, actually, Roundup is sprayed on our grains for harvest. I was like, Roundup, like the weed killer that you see in Home Depot? And he said, yes. So it's sprayed as a pre-harvest drying agent to make it easier to harvest everything. And I said, well, that's terrible. I think it's likely linked to this big problem we're having with grains. Isn't there something you can do at General Mills to change your buying habits? You were enormous buyers. And he said, no, it's going to take about 2 decades to get farmers to change their practice. So I was appalled. And I came back, I started reading all the research I possibly could on glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. And at that time, the Roundup cancer trials were beginning in San Francisco. And so a bunch of plaintiffs were claiming that exposure to glyphosate had caused their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I live near San Francisco, so I got in the car and I went up to the courtroom, or actually to the courthouse, and I was actually intending on doing like some protesting against Monsanto. And I thought there'd be a crowd there because this is the very first time that Monsanto has ever gone in front of a jury ever. And so it's a huge deal. And I got there and there was no one there. I walked straight in. I walked right into the courtroom, sat down, and realized, oh, very few people are going to be talking about this really important trial. So I'm going to sit here. I'm going to name myself Glyphosate Girl, and I'm going to document everything that is happening in this courtroom. And actually, it ended up being the same trial where RFK Jr. was one of the attorneys, which is how I got to know him and
Oh,
kind of
wow.
got launched in this. Yeah.
And what is the smoking gun about glyphosate? That, how do we know that it causes all these health conditions?
So it causes a bunch of things. And what was interesting with these cancer trials, and the reason why they could really nail them on cancer, is because the body of evidence was so great in published research to show that indeed it causes cancer. Even though the EPA continues to this day to say it does not, when you're watching or you're involved in a lawsuit and you get all of these discovery documents and you look in and you see, oh my gosh, not only do they know that it causes cancer, but the EPA also knows that it causes cancer, and they're keeping this from the public, and they don't care. So there's that element that around that time too, in terms of cancer, the International Agency for Research on Cancer in 2015 came out and said that glyphosate is a likely probable human carcinogen based only on independent studies, nothing provided by Monsanto or Bayer, any of the companies that manufacture glyphosate. And so the body of evidence was just very solid. Now you get into other issues. Something that we talk about a lot, and a lot of people do, is the fact that glyphosate acts as an antibiotic, and it specifically can kill our good gut bacteria in our microbiome, and really contributes to the idea of leaky gut. I don't know if people know what leaky gut is, but it is an issue that really is central to a lot of the chronic disease that we have today, in that the integrity of our gut barrier is compromised, and it lets toxins that should stay inside of the gut out into the bloodstream. And what's fascinating is there is research that shows not only does glyphosate come in and it kills the good gut bacteria that keeps everything strong there, but it also can make that leaky gut worse. And so we're eating this all day on anything basically that's not organic. And even sometimes organic things have glyphosate. So you start thinking about what that impact has. And it's a very strange antibiotic, glyphosate is, because it specifically selects these good gut bacteria and allows more pathogenic bacteria to proliferate, things like E. coli. And so, but that's just that cancer and the gut are just two of the multitude of issues that are connected with glyphosate.
And is there testing currently for glyphosate? Because I was speaking to someone the other day about this who has a family farm near Sacramento. They're organic, but she said that doesn't mean that glyphosate doesn't flow onto their farm and get into their produce. So is there a qualification currently? Um,
Yeah. Oh, it's so sad because organic farmers are trying to do the right thing, and then they can get contaminated. And it's not only drift, but it could be through irrigation. Interestingly, it can also come from manure that's used as fertilizer because they can't use synthetic fertilizer. And so they'll go over to the sometimes the CAFOs or whatever the feedlot is, they get that manure, but that cow has been eating the GMO grain that was sprayed with glyphosate. And so now it's in the soil of the organic farms and can be taken up into the crops. So that's just really disappointing. And it's something that the USDA, when they do their organic certification, are regularly testing for glyphosate. And so it should not be present, but in independent studies, it has been present in many different organic products, just at a much, much lower level than what you'd see in conventional things.
And why would there be resistance to banning it? Is it banned anywhere currently?
It is not currently banned. And it's sad because in Europe there was a large movement in just before COVID to ban it. And in fact, in Germany and in Austria, there's some amazing activists who got it really to the finish line. And then the EU Parliament said, no, you can't just arbitrarily decide you're going to ban this pesticide. And they took the control back. They somehow were more in cahoots with industry and were able to keep this on the market and renewed. I think it's for another 10 or 15 years. I think it's 10 years. And and there's a lot of resistance to banning it because now it actually has become integral in our farming system and farming systems around the world. And so while most people would argue don't get in the direct line of it, our entire GMO system in the United States, which is most of our farmland at this point, those seeds have been developed to be resistant to the effects of Roundup. So GMO Roundup ready corn and Roundup ready soy, Roundup ready cotton. We have these crops designed to have just more and more glyphosate sprayed. And so you take that away from them, and then you have this whole system that begins to collapse. And it's something that actually needs to happen, but I don't think it needs to be a drastic collapse because you don't want farmers to struggle because this actually isn't their fault that now they're dependent on these chemicals. In the same way people are often dependent on drugs, they are also dependent on using these things. And so the ideal situation is guiding farmers off of the use of the various pesticides through a compassionate way with other farmers going in and teaching them the ways of regenerative agriculture. And what's amazing is, and I've talked with many of these farmers, what's amazing is watching as they adopt better practices and they put soil health first, you'll see this dramatic drop in pesticide use, not just glyphosate, but a bunch of different pesticides like the fungicides and the insecticides. Because when the soil is happy, and healthy, then the crops are much healthier and they no longer need this help from the different predators. So it's actually really cool. If people have seen Biggest Little Farm, a lot of them are a lot like that. And it's very inspiring seeing just healing on a mass scale.
So it's interesting you mentioned scale. Can you scale regenerative organic farming and make it profitable and beneficial for farmers? So is
So
there, I think RFK was mentioning an off-ramp from the farming system. What does that look like? Is it possible?
So it's so possible and it's just so exciting. I've worked with a group called Regenified, which was founded by the farmer Gabe Brown, who is just an epic American farmer that has shown on his own ranch and throughout all these farms that he's helped his colleagues build out, that you indeed can do it regeneratively. You can do it with low to no pesticides, and it is happening now at scale, actually through this company, Regenified, where you have these 1,000 acres that can be worked on it at one time. And so, what part of the problem with the organic movement has been that we haven't seen an increase in farming organically. There are higher prices paid, but in this country, our organic farm numbers have actually gone down. And it's just really, really hard to go in and tell your GMO or your grain farmer that's currently using chemicals, oh, we'd like you to go organic and be regenerative. And you give them this long list of demands, and they're like, wait, you aren't even a farmer. Why are you coming in and saying, this is so easy to transition or whatever? And so the beauty of it is when farmers can go in with their own expertise and see eye to eye with other farmers and share what has been so successful. And I mean, there's beautiful stories. There's stories of farmers who decide to transition half of their farm first and they won't spray a fungicide that year. And they're so nervous that it's going to ruin their crop. And, maybe the first year is a little bit harder. The second year it gets better. And by the third year, you really see a resilient ecosystem on the farms that is super exciting. And, it almost is a religious experience for a lot of the farmers because they're putting so much faith that nature is going to take care of them.
And what does the resistance look like as far as big agriculture and their influence politically? Because I see this as, I actually see the MAHA movement though it's kind of a coalition that I want to ask you about, and RFK like coming into the fold of Trump and kind of making a deal. I see them actually as kind of natural partner movements, because this, to me, this is an attack on people's health, and their sovereignty. So, what does resistance look like from big agriculture beyond like media buys, influence in the press? I have a personal story where I actually went to the Hippocrates Institute. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Oh,
Palm Beach. It's like
love
a
it.
raw vegan retreat that's been around for decades.
Oh, cool.
That was like my intro to food as medicine, and kind of intentional eating and nutrition. But the people that that place drew were very like, big agriculture wants to burn this place down. These people are such a threat. This movement is such a threat to big agriculture and pharma. Um, so what does that look like for you? What do you feel like you're up against? I thought these people were like nuts, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
But then, there is a huge threat if people sort of wake up and start eating and consuming things in a different way. Then there's a huge financial risk, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they definitely are not incentivized to have us wake up to what we're eating, I think. And we have a really enormous problem with there's a big disconnect between what the corporations want and what the people by and large want. And we're seeing that emblematically on display with the way MAHA has developed. And it is so interesting because I saw that this was coming actually during COVID when a lot of Republicans were starting to actually follow my Instagram. And I was like, this is very interesting because I think that people are feeling like it's an infringement on their freedoms to be exposed to these chemicals, which is absolutely true.
Did you feel that way yourself?
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, horribly so because once you realize it, and actually my background was in business, and I remember being at a business school reunion, and I was giving a talk on these things, and so many of my colleagues or my classmates are healthcare investors, or like they do VC, but they also do healthcare devices, and I'm sitting like thinking, oh my gosh, and I actually said at some point, you guys can't keep on out innovating what's happening at this very basic biological level. You can try, but your nature is going to win. And we have to get back to the root of what is even causing these situations that you're needing to be investing in medical devices and medications. And it's a really hard concept I've found. I don't know if you've found this too, but I feel like it's a hard concept to tell someone unless they've had a personal experience, whether a child's been sick, if they've been sick. It until that point, it's kind of a closed off situation. And in fact, to the point that's surprising right now, because there's a really upsetting thing happening across the country in terms of pesticide companies are coming in, Bayer and ChemChina, and they're going state by state trying to steal our ability to sue. They are trying to legislate in a pesticide liability shield so that if you get cancer, if you get infertility, you can't sue the company. And shockingly, the legislators, our American legislators, are passing this by and large in these different states, and they are willing to take our rights away on behalf of foreign corporations' ability to profit and be irresponsible with the pesticides. It's actually so mind-blowing this is happening at the same time as MAHA because it is so bad. And having to see what we're up against, and interestingly, these are red states almost entirely, and it right now looks like it is party line based voting. So you still have the Democrats are saying that's not a good idea. They're pro health. What you also are seeing are these Republican, like old, long time Republican people that are still in this older staunch that hasn't woken up to MAHA yet. And so they are still committed to that big ag, oh, these pesticides, like literally standing up during these different senator briefings and hearings and saying, we know this doesn't cause cancer because the EPA says so. And just saying all these party lines, you're like, wake up. It's 2025 right now. Have you checked your party? Because your party is going a different direction. Like you're going
Yeah.
to need to get on board or you're going to be replaced because people are tired of being poisoned.
Yeah. Well, I loved what Nicole Shanahan did during RFK's confirmation hearing when it looked very iffy if he was going to be confirmed. And she basically threatened all of those politicians that were going to vote against him with being primaried, which I think
Oh, it
is
was so good.
an awesome. I remember like before she put that thing out, I was like, I posted something like every one who votes against Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, and Kash Patel automatically primaried. And then she put that thing out there. It's so awesome to have someone with resources like that
Oh, it's so
fighting this
amazing. She's our
battle.
treasure.
Yeah, I hope she runs for governor of California, actually.
So badly. Oh, I so badly hope so. We really need it badly in California. Oh my gosh.
But it's interesting. I mean, what you mentioned politically, I don't even see like I see MAGA and everything else. I see establishment and then MAGA.
Hmm.
I don't consider like these people call them rhinos, but these Republicans are not actually really part of this movement.
They're not.
They're just corrupt establishment politicians that are probably, get funding from big agriculture and big pharmaceutical and vote along those lines. They're just corrupt. So interestingly, I see, you know, MAGA, like, I guess it's the new Republican Party, but in a way, it's not. It's a new movement.
Isn't it so fascinating? So I've been independent my whole life
Mhm.
and coming into this and I'm suddenly learning, these differences basically within the Republican Party. And it's interesting because it does take a moment to understand that there is a difference between MAGA and the old fashioned guard. Um, and
Completely.
MAHA, I think definitely aligns more with MAGA.
Yeah, and they want to, the Republican establishment like sabotaged Trump and this movement. Um, yeah, I mean, um, as far as California is concerned in the pandemic, also I'm wondering like the social consequences that you've faced for your activism. Um, I
Oh man.
it's everyone has like a story about it, but you're very public. Like, were you publicly a Trump supporter or a MAHA? Like, how did you do that before the election?
Oh my gosh. So, I was obviously like a big Kennedy for president person. And even that, because I'm from a very, very Silicon Valley liberal suburb. And people don't typically talk about politics, but it's sort of assumed you're going to be Democrat and very like, patriotic about that. And so I actually put a sign up for RFK on my front lawn amidst like my garden that I have. I converted my front lawn into a garden for veggies, and that actually was a little controversial in itself. Someone in my neighborhood reported me and didn't think that I should be able to grow these veggies and fruits in my front lawn. I'm like, why is it different than any other plant? So that's sort of like what we're dealing with. And but I put this sign up there and not
Yourself.
even Trump, just RFK while he is running as an independent, right? Actually, I think I put it up there when he was a Democrat. Um, and so it was just wild to see.
What
And
was what did people think of that? Like, why?
well, they thought that therefore I'm anti-science and one of those crazy anti-vaxxers, you know. And what's so strange is I never came from even the vaccine world. I've come from the food and farming perspective, but of course it's all lumped together. But that was the conclusion. And then when he joined with Trump, um, it was I just well, it's interesting people that come
How did
out.
you feel about that at the time? Like, what was your reaction
Um,
when he did that?
my reaction was I was so angry with the Democratic Party at the time, like so many of us were, that for not even entertaining Bobby at all. And all this corruption was really coming to the front. So at that point, I was like, well, I see why you would make that decision. I mean, it's not like I've been a lifelong yay Trump person, but I also have been independent and kind of not as passionate. Like I've never been caught up in the TDS. And so I was like, well, I could see why you'd make this decision. All right, let's go. And then, you start meeting people that are also interested in these subjects. And I think sitting in, and you probably have the same experience, sitting in California where you only hear one perspective, and then suddenly your world is opened up to this whole other side that you've been told is just these are shameful, racist people or whatever you have that are on the right side. You realize that that's not the case. And it's really mind altering, because you're like, what have we been told? This is all fake.
So, well, yeah, the fakeness of I see the connection between Maha and MAGA in like the fakeness of a lot of the world we live in. And that's like a sort of joining point. Like what is real foundational health? It's like
Hmm.
soil, food, light, sleep, all of those things that are like real and foundational. And then I think naturally right wing sort of MAGA people are like suspicious of government, of money printing, of like an attack on the nuclear family, all of these kind of basic real things. So I feel like they're kind of just pointed in different directions, but there's a spiritual overlap there.
It's so funny you say that about the suspicious of government because my husband is actually from rural North Carolina and so you can imagine his family is very different than mine coming from California. And we used to laugh because his dad, who sadly passed actually of an ALS-like uh, disease following pesticide exposure, ironically, he used to like hide money in a safe. Like he didn't trust banks. Like he didn't want people having any of his information, like super suspicious. And not like he was up to no good, but that's sort of how their small North Carolina community was. And now I'm like, oh, that was smart. At
Yeah,
the
he
time, I was
like
like, that's great. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea.
yeah, there's so many things like that now. I feel almost like um embarrassed about the realizations of these things that people have
Totally.
talked about for so long that are just so basic and sensible. But we probably come from similar backgrounds where um, you get kind of programmed to think a certain way. And that's where like there's this whole apparatus of like painting RFK as an anti-vaxxer. The latest thing was he's a predator.
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
and
I
I,
haven't even
I
seen
find
that
it
one.
it's so absurd. Like liberals that I know kind of pride themselves on the snobbery of their diets and their food and their lifestyles, and love to make fun of, obese people in the South that drink like, shitty
Ah,
7-Eleven stuff. And then along comes RFK Jr., who's like one of them in incredible shape himself, with a mission, who sued Monsanto. And the immediate reaction is like, oh no, he's an anti-vaxxer and like it's like it's lunacy.
it is crazy.
Um,
I mean, I just can't believe how successful the propaganda was to convert this person that should have been their shining star to being the devil and evil and not
it's
so
he RFK I think is like the IQ test or just like the,
totally. It's like the breaking
the
point.
like how captured is your mind? Like what's your opinion on RFK? Like that's the litmus test.
Completely. It is. It totally is. And the people that just don't get it or don't take the time, to understand it. And that's part of the problem that I've found, whether it's glyphosate or any of these issues, Bobby, like all of it, is like describing the situation takes more time than what attention span typically is now.
100%.
And I
How do
think
you,
that's the impediment.
on that very subject, how do you wake people up as an activist against glyphosate and pesticides and a number of things? How do you wake people up if you, like in my experience, it was getting sick
Hmm.
myself.
Oh, you were too? Yeah.
Yeah, I was poisoned by a pharmaceutical drug.
Oh
Uh,
my gosh.
and I have, for the last like 7 years, worked on trying to cure myself because it's outside of like the medical establishment can't do it. Um, so I've had my own personal journey with this, so I understand it, and it's forced me into a lifestyle and like, without sounding, um, it's impossible not to sound kind of douchey, but you come into like a state of awareness after doing all of these things. Um, so how do you convince people who haven't had that experience or don't have a kid that's been injured by something? How do you wake them up to the importance of this?
Oh my gosh. Isn't it so hard? Because if you're on that path and you were like me, because just tapering off of all of these psych drugs was horrendous and there's not guidance on it and healing on the after effects of the neurological part of that. And you're like, you become best friends with like all of the books and the PubMed pieces, you can find as you try to save your life, basically. And so those are dark places that definitely pull desperate measures. Um, but it's so hard because and you probably have this happen to you. I have many friends who have autoimmunity now, and or their kid. I mean, most of the kids I know of my kids' friends have some sort of physical ailment now that wouldn't have been the case, like 20 or 30 years ago. And um, And it's so hard to see the different perspective. And maybe it just is because these things aren't extreme enough to push the change. But when someone comes in with high ANA numbers and autoimmunity of some kind, and their doctor has suggested, okay, you know what, you have Crohn's disease, but it's great because you can just do this IV drip every 4 weeks and you're going to be good to go, and accepting that answer and thinking that, and a lot of times it's directed and it's gotten back to me from friends like, oh, you're the weird hippie one that wants to address these things naturally. And I'm like, well, I would be scared that that drug won't work at much longer. And then I'm going to be stuck in a worse position. And so, what's so amazing though is, and you've probably been here for the same timeline, is watching, like, say, 7 years ago versus today. The awareness is so much bigger. The amount of people that now have gone to a functional doctor, or which is a little bit more palatable, I think, than like naturopathic, which some people have a hard time getting their mind around. But we have tons of functional doctors that are starting to pop up, and it's amazing. And so now my go-to, if they're not ready to hear about the pesticides, because that's annoying, I guess, still to a lot of people, even if they have stomach problems, um, is being able to refer people to functional doctors, because they'll say the same thing that I'm saying, but because when it comes from an MD's mouth, then it's very different. Also, I'm finding a lot of excitement in the college age kids. I've been doing college lectures, and they are so much more on top of this than any other group. And I think that's the help of TikTok and Instagram. They want to-dos. They're swapping out their water bottles that are plastic with stainless steel options. They're huge supporters of MAHA. It's just so exciting because they can see the writings on the wall. They're not feeling great. Their parents are probably sick. This person is providing something that looks very appealing, particularly to the boys. And one thing I haven't talked about actually with glyphosate is I actually went to the EPA. I've been to the EPA several times to talk to the Office of Pesticide Programs about recent research on glyphosate and what it's doing to us. And I'd never really focused on endocrine disruption specifically, but so much research has come out now about the impact of glyphosate on hormones. And I just can't keep it quiet anymore. One specific research piece that came out was by Dr. Shauna Swan, who is a fabulous doctor, or a toxicologist, who wrote the book Countdown. And she went on Joe Rogan. She studies genitalia's change according to different endocrine disruptors. And so one of these was glyphosate. So she and a group of scientists studied the level of glyphosate in the urine of second trimester pregnant women. And then she went and she studied the distance between the anus and the vagina of the baby girls that were born. And she found that the higher the level of the glyphosate in the second trimester urine, the longer the distance between the vagina and the anus, which is a masculinization of our baby fetuses of girls. And so shocking and so terrible. So I started digging even further into the research, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not only connected with this, but also decreased testosterone, decreased estrogen. It goes in and it detaches the embryos from the inside of the uterus, so it's connected with miscarriages. It's causing these malformations, and they aren't doing anything about it. And I went in and I said, your rules for what's an endocrine disruptor are this. And you decided after a quick glance years ago at some industry provided research that you don't think it's an endocrine disruptor. And so you are just going to move on and not look at it anymore. And so I put a picture of boxer shorts up on the slide. I was like, this is what's actually happening. And let me tell you what else. It is found in semen. I took 4 samples from 4 different men, who 2 of them had Impossible Burger beforehand, because we know that's huge with glyphosate, and then sent their semen samples into a lab. They all came back positive for glyphosate. Well, glyphosate is shown to kill sperm. We have a 50% decrease over the last several decades in sperm counts. And I'm like, okay, so you eat this glyphosate, it crosses the blood testes barrier, it goes into your semen, it is known to kill sperm. What are we doing? And I would like to go and tell the IVF companies, hey, fertility companies, you should be checking for this because I think it's dramatically impacting fertility. But they would never would because this is this exploding new industry of IVF that now, the government is going to subsidize. And so you have yet another business built around people not being able to get pregnant. And back to the Gen Zers, they are upset about this. There's a big new boost in like the desire to be masculine among the boys and really pushing on that bro front. And it's amazing because they want to stay away from these endocrine disruptors. And I'm like, great. So I'm trying to shove that in front of that crowd as much as possible.
Yeah, it's like we're in the 80s again.
Totally.
I love it. But imagine being a public official elected by citizens to represent them and then going against this and like poisoning citizens and kids.
Poisoning, taking their
Like,
ability to procreate. And you know what? I was on Fox and I said the same thing. I cannot believe the big fights that are going on right now about abortion because you have about 1 million abortions a year in this country. 7 million people cannot get pregnant when they want to. I think that is a bigger crisis than the ethics of abortion. Just and so my hope is that by this becoming maybe that health issues becoming a Republican issue, maybe some of the churches will start to stand alongside this idea of fostering, fertility and restoring fertility to people who have had it stripped because it is just awful. And we don't have a future as a species at this rate because we can't procreate.
that's an interesting, yeah, that's an interesting angle. There's the ethical question. Like, are you comfortable answering that question? Like, are you pro-choice or pro-life?
Oh, I am pro-choice because I'm freedom person.
Hmm.
But that being said, I have not. I've known many people, not many, but several people who have gotten abortions. It's always been a very sad thing,
Yes.
and I don't think it's something that people take lightly when they do it. And I know far, far more people that are panicked about the fact they can't get pregnant,
Interesting.
and far more friends that are having IVF treatment. And I just think that the focus needs to go back on that. If you're really pro-life, then you should be pro this part of life too, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, yeah, my position on abortion like shifted during this like kind of I think I was programmed to think of it as just like a version of contraception.
Mm.
It has become I think it's always a tragedy. So my position has adjusted on it, certainly. Um, I'd say I think most Americans are like pro-choice within reason, but I think it's always a tragedy. Like,
I think that's right. I think
uh,
that's how most people would feel.
yeah. Um,
It was so strange though. I was in DC, so this is what I'm not cool with. I was in DC, and this person was wearing a t-shirt, love abortion, and it's like no one loves abortion. That's
yeah,
sick.
this
Like
is all bad. It's all bad.
what? It's a serious tragedy that's very sad.
Yeah. I do think that well, I think leftists who are very like radically pro-choice and not like that t-shirt pro-choice think of it in the way that maybe right-wing people think of gun control, that like
Yeah.
any adjustment to it, any regulation of it is like a no-go and is an absolutist like attack and an attempt to remove something.
Yeah, that's
Um,
likely true.
but are there other things that you diverge from MAGA as being like a MAHA person? Like, are there other issues that you diverge on?
Well, let me think. And I haven't been following a lot of the things that closely. I really like what Doge is doing right now. I feel very sad for some of the victims that have been accidentally cut out. I'm hopeful that, like most tech companies, once the shakeout happens, that things that are good will be put back into place.
Hmm.
I'm I'm appreciating that because if you've been following a lot with the national debt, we just simply cannot afford to keep going like we are in this country. Like we just can't. And so, thank goodness in many ways that this is happening right now. I don't think that trans guys should be in women's sports. I'm aligned with them with that because that
Hmm.
is terrible for all the women athletes out there. And I can't even imagine when I was back playing tennis if I had to play against someone large and much stronger than me. That would have been terrible. Um, and so, I don't know. I think I'm probably, once again, like most Americans, I'm actually a pretty middle of the road person, pretty socially liberal, and just want freedom and health and happiness for people. I mean, it's sort of where I fall,
Yeah.
you know?
It's a shame it's so hard to get through to people on this.
It is.
Uh, and that
I think it's most of us. Like,
I do
I just,
too. And I find it tragic in the conversations I have with friends who maybe like have different views or just aren't aware. I find it tragic because I feel like it's just an information. There's a critical thinking gap for sure, but there's also just like an information gap.
yes.
And we're just living in different realities. So I find it's so sad to me. And I think the biggest culprit in all of this is the media,
Totally.
that has completely abandoned its mission, um, and is basically the media mostly in this country is like it's activism and it's divided friends, families for life. Like in many cases, it's so sinful. I have so much contempt
Yeah.
for those people. And then the other thing I've noticed are like after the election, I want to ask you about the social consequences that you've paid for your activism and your politics, but I find some of the new entrants, like post-election, that risked nothing
Oh, I
and now are sort of like opportunistically
know. Totally.
aligning themselves, like Cenk Uygur. I think Fetterman is full of shit.
Oh God, Fetterman.
Um, and, you know, a number of other people, Michael Rappaport, some of these people who are like, I find it like Chris Cuomo, they should apologize first and foremost if they've had some kind of awakening after torturing the rest of us, spreading, you know, lying, dividing. It's it,
Totally.
it's horrendous. And then just like that, it's like, oh yeah, this isn't so bad. Trump isn't that bad.
Yeah, what the heck?
Like, fuck you.
Totally.
Go apologize to
Oh,
all of us and go disappear for a year.
yeah, exactly.
Like
Please.
maybe come, you know, like, but that kind of
And
stuff.
buy us some flowers.
Yeah, I honestly think we have to have from the pandemic, from all of these, there has to be a truth and reconciliation on this because too much has happened.
Absolutely.
And we still we continue to pay social consequences. Like in my professional life, in my personal life, it hasn't been the same for years.
Yeah.
And we live in this kind of like isolated
Sorry.
world.
Then
So Kelly, what have been like the social consequences of your activism and politics in your world? Are you like ostracized?
oh my gosh, yeah, it has been quite a thing. And people are in general polite, but no, it definitely has been, I'm not invited out to as many coffees. I actually went ahead and I posted a picture of myself at the MAHA ball and I got some really choice things DM'd to me. Um,
From people that you know?
some who I know, some who I don't, but yeah, some old time people that I know, not believing that I would possibly be with such a hateful group. And it's so hard because I don't know how you can even explain it because even when the facts are right in front of people, they don't see it. And so my feeling is, and this is what I tell myself, and you probably do too, is I'm like, I know that I'm on the right side of history here.
Yeah.
Like this is the people aren't there yet, but I'm on the right side of history because I know the real science, which isn't settled, is on our side. I know that freedom is the only way forward for our country. And even though the media is telling everyone that Trump is the opposite of freedom, if you spend the time and you actually look and see what's happened with all the media manipulation and all of the power and all of the World Economic Forum and all of that stuff, you take the time and you do that, then you're going to see, okay, this MAHA situation is the right direction. And so I'm just sitting back waiting for that. But you're right. Like some people have come over, like, actually, this is kind of interesting. I'm like, that's right. It is. It is pretty interesting. And I mean, who can argue with wanting to decrease childhood illness? I mean, I just think that's the strangest thing to take issue with.
Yeah. Are there things that you've avoided that might like that are maybe adjacent to organic and regenerative farming, like the 5G stuff?
Oh,
Is
so
there
I've
stuff that you
got,
like stay away from to not be, because it's so
it's
easy to be
crazy.
painted as a whack job?
Oh my God. Well, you know what? This is it's interesting you bring up 5G because actually, and this is where Nicole Shanahan actually helped us a lot. She's local here too. And I got a group together with a fabulous nurse who's nearby too. And in San Mateo, California, they were putting Verizon was trying to dump. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You have to edit that out. Okay.
That's okay.
Um, in San Mateo, Verizon was trying to just put 5G towers throughout our city. Like it was just laid everywhere. We know them to be dangerous and they're right up next to houses, like terrible. And we got a whole big group together in the city of San Mateo and we fought for a year and a half and we finally got an ordinance change. So the tower that is was supposed to go in next to my house is no longer. And it was a long path, but certainly a lot of people thought that was crazy because the telecom companies say that it is actually for cell phone reception, but it's not. Actually, 5G towers are for broadband. If you don't have wired broadband, it is for broadband internet. So basically for video games or whatever. And so the fight with people saying, why I don't have good cell phone reception. I really need these towers to go in, and then having to explain that, but they've tuned me out as a loon by that time. And so that's one thing. But now I know that the city of San Mateo is much safer because they're not going to be radiated next to their head all night. So that's a good thing. Now, the one that I've started getting into recently, very tentatively, but my son is actually a college student and their class, their political science class, brought up geoengineering. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay, so it's being taught in college. I now feel safe enough to bring up the fact that we have chemtrails and we are being dumped with aluminum. And I started bringing that to some meetings I had with Congress people because our food supply is just covered with aluminum now. Like aluminum in the soil, it's aluminum is everywhere. It's really, really destructive to all life. And
And why are they doing it?
so they're showering this down in the chemtrails to block the sun's radiation. And I've talked to a lot of people that have worked in this chemtrail world for a while, and I've heard everything from actually the ozone layer is 70% gone. And so they're trying to cover up for that so they can keep on polluting. To, well, this is actually military, or this is just a big money grab for chemical manufacturers to create the stuff that they're spraying. So I've heard a lot of different things. All I know is it's happening. And we're in Northern California, we used to have the bluest, bluest skies all winter. It has been gray mist or like this weird yellow light that comes from the reflection through the aluminum of the sun. And I'm like, can't you guys see this? Like, that's just a contrail. Like, okay, a
I
contrail doesn't
can't believe
stay
this
there all
is
day.
real. Like, I
Yeah,
can't really believe this is real.
it's
If someone mentioned chemtrails to me like 4 years ago, I would just write them off
oh,
and,
two.
this is like insanity.
It's like they would never do
Um,
that. That'd be so expensive, right? And
yeah, just like
oh
I
no.
remember I met some like this sort of raw vegan hippie girl when I first moved to LA, and she was like, those are government drones, like spraying psilocybin. She had like a different take
Oh
on
yeah.
the
Oh, I
chemtrails
remember
part.
that.
And she was like, maybe a flat earther or something. And I'm like, oh, this is like insane. But
Totally.
chemtrails, as you describe them, like they're real.
I mean, they're real. They're
Um,
being taught in universities. And I'm like, oh my gosh, stop like telling us they're not real when we know that they're being educated like on this issue.
there was another thing that I saw on your Instagram, which is mRNA vaccines in crops.
Oh, yes. Oh my
Is that
gosh.
real?
Yeah, that is something that is on the table. It hasn't happened yet, but they're looking for any way to use this mRNA. And they're doing the same, you've probably seen with the livestock. They're going to start vaccinating also there. Um, the crazy thing is thinking about just spraying these basically spraying the vaccines in an aerial way on crops is just, I guess that they just can't help themselves between that and, for example, there's another thing that's coming up with a bunch of GMO 2.0s are being introduced into our food supply. And these are the GMOs that are developed using CRISPR technologies. And there's a lot of money going behind this, like tons and tons of cash. Um, there's a company that was founded by David Friedberg, for example, and he's one of the um, hosts of the podcast All In. And he came up with a company earlier years ago that was sold to Monsanto, and it was like a digital computing program for farmers and actually very helpful. Anyway, he's been working on this. He's really loves tech and he loves biotech. And he's like, this is great. We're going to use CRISPR. We're going to be able to feed the world like things because they're going to be stronger seeds. And so one of the things that is being launched right now is strawberry that would be resistant to some of the fungal outbreaks in Florida. Well, we know from regenerative agriculture that you can also do it using regular seeds that are not genetically modified. If you just create the right environment around them without the chemicals, then the fungal infections stop. So there's just so many people trying to make money off of our food system. And sadly, there's money for the farmer in regenerative agriculture for sure, but there's not money for all the corporations.
These tech people love to tinker with nature,
They
humanity. They
can't help
can't help
themselves.
themselves.
It's nonstop.
And decide and want to decide how we're supposed to live our lives. Like,
Totally. Both
just
of it.
make a
All
great product and leave us alone. Like,
totally.
let me buy a phone and let it just be a phone. Like, don't make me
Right? That's
consent
it.
to you listening to everything. We're under attack from so many different angles, from like food, technology. It's just it's incredible.
It
Uh,
really is.
how would you how would you suggest people who are interested in living healthy, like how do you avoid glyphosate and what would you recommend? Like this isn't medical advice, but how would you recommend people live basically?
So I would say do your best to buy as organically as possible. Have your food be organic whenever it can be. If it isn't organic, regenerative, if something's labeled regenerative but not organic, it likely has lower levels of chemicals on it. Um, also, make sure you're filtering your water. So I like the water filter clearly filtered. It is fantastic. It gets glyphosate out. It also gets the super toxic herbicide atrazine out of drinking water. I have one installed underneath my sink, which I love. I would go and talk to whoever is your groundskeeper, make sure they are not spraying Roundup. And if they are, explain to them that they could get cancer. I've done that several times where I've actually stopped the car and said, hey, I don't want you getting cancer. And so oftentimes that's concerning to them. And and so those are really the main things. And it is not it's unfortunate that it is in the rain. Oh, one other thing, if you're using any cotton products, um, it is found in cotton. And so things like tampons and pads and diapers can have glyphosate in them. And so for my personal products, I use organic versions of those things. And that's great because you don't want to be shoving glyphosate and other pesticides up into your privates.
Um, and what is the ultimate goal like at the end of the day here? Do you see like an all-out ban of glyphosate in the US? Is that the goal?
So I cannot imagine that would be a goal for sure, but I can't imagine that that will happen. Um, I think it's naturally going to fade out as there's so much weed resistance to glyphosate. It's not working anymore because the weeds are outsmarting the glyphosate. And I think that there's going to be public pushback on this pre-harvest spray that I was talking about. I think that that will be something that probably is banned, probably in the next 10 years, particularly now RFK Jr. is in there. And I think that from what I've seen, farmers don't want to be spending money on these pesticides. So if we can start subsidizing a different kind of agriculture where it is not just dependent on GMO Roundup Ready crops, you're going to see a decrease also in the use of glyphosate. So unfortunately, I don't think it's as easy as just ban it because a lot of the herbicides that they would bring in to replace glyphosate, some are even worse.
Mhm.
And so it's like it needs to be a full systematic change before we can really reach um, the goal of decreasing the toxicity and exposure.
And the last question, what are you most excited for with RFK? Like, what do you think the most impactful thing is that he'll be able to do?
Oh my gosh. So I've had a few meetings with Jim Jones, who's now gone. He was head of human foods for the FDA. It was so incredibly frustrating to go there with results of all these toxins that we found in food. I even like there was a study that Moms Across America did that they found gluten actually in the gluten-free bagels at Trader Joe's, and that's actually really horrible for a lot of celiacs. And they didn't this guy wouldn't issue a recall of the bagels, and like he wouldn't do we were there were aviary contraceptives found in the food that we tested. There were all these horrible things, and not only did they not do anything, but they didn't even follow up with us after we reported it. So the FDA was so beyond repair, and after each of those meetings I would go in and be like, it just all has to change. Like it has to be gutted. All of these things, the EPA, the USDA, the FDA, all need to be gutted and just rebuilt with ethical people because it is so far gone. And so I think seeing this shakeup is exactly what needed to happen. And I think just that structural change of just breaking these long, long careers of people that are there just working on behalf of the corporations is what I'm most excited about with RFK Jr.
Yeah, I actually saw him at the gym and mentioned this pharma issue to him just in passing, like I didn't
Oh,
want to
no
bother
way.
him. And he
Yep.
was like incredibly humble and asked me like a number of questions. He actually wanted to understand what had happened and what the drug was,
Oh my
which
gosh.
I found kind of incredible. Just on a personal level, I could tell that he was like, he just seems like an unassuming, interested person.
Isn't it
Um,
amazing? Because you would think he could be a super cocky guy or whatever.
Not
No,
remotely, not at
not at
all.
all. Like
Yeah.
just a normal person that cares. And I love that he has that curiosity because, and another thing, like I think he was involved, or at least he's friends with the lawyers that did the work on SSRIs. And I think it's nice to be bringing a national attention to this. And I think he's known a lot of people that have struggled getting off of them or know that the long-term consequences of being on SSRIs for a long time can be bad. And um, for me personally, I think actually they did fit a need for me at one point in my life, actually not during the illness, but I did feel better. It's not something that people should take lightly going on though, because if you're not informed that it can be hard to get off of, you're much more likely to just take them and think, well, I can get off of them at any time. Well, that's not always the case. And so I'm excited that he's going to address that because it leads to a lot of unnecessary suicides.
Yeah. Then final question. Do you think you would have had become, without getting sick, do you think your life would have unfolded very differently?
Oh my gosh, totally. So this is the thing. Like, I'm like, that was an amazing gift. I had like a life where I was very happy, but I didn't feel productive. And one of the points I was having a full body MRI because I couldn't walk anymore, actually. And I was like, oh my God, what are they going to find? I think this is it. Like this is it for me. And I made this, it was a 2 hour MRI, and I made a very, very real live deal with God that if I could have a clean MRI and I could get better, that I was going to do something to change this so this doesn't happen to other people. And then when the doctor came in and said, you know what, it was a totally clean MRI. I mean, I was just crying. I'm like, okay, well, here I go. So, you probably get that sense too. I think once you've been through something really traumatic like that, it's like, okay, then what is my purpose for still being here? And what can I do to alleviate the pain of others?
Yeah. Kelly, thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.